Hello everyone, my name is James Williams. I am the Director of Programs with the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. It's Thursday, so that means it's another MEF live webinar. So some of you might not be familiar with who and what MEF is. We are the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. We've been around over 20 years. We've got over 200 member companies around the world, mobile operators, security companies, banks, government institutions, you name it, we have the members from those industrial sectors. And a very, very important discussion area for MEF members is the whole area of business messaging and ultimately how businesses talk to their customers. And of course, within that is the channel of voice. It's very, very easy to overlook something that billions of us do every day. What do? We talk. And what do businesses around the world do to communicate with their customers? They speak to their customers, they call their customers. So yes, the world of chat apps, the world of business messaging, such as A2P SMS is big as well, but voice is still absolutely huge and cannot be forgotten. So here at MEF, we provide opportunities for our members to engage with each other and the wider ecosystem. And what you're seeing right now, our live webinars, is just one of those examples. If any of you watching live have any questions, please do ask us those questions. We'll see that in the chat. We will attend to the questions. So my first duty, now I've introduced MEF, is to actually introduce the topic. Now, the topic today is the world of voice, which I alluded to right there, and it's exploring the path to authenticated communication. So the word attestation will be used a fair bit in this webinar. It comes from Latin attestare, to prove. So proving, authenticating is absolutely critical to build trust. And I'm pleased to say that today's webinar is sponsored by MEF member Numerical. And having mentioned the trust word, I'm actually going to introduce Sarah first, because talking about trust, you have a nice job title, don't you?
I do.
Go on. Don't be shy. What is it? Yeah.
For sure. So hi, I'm Sarah Delphi. I am the VP of Trust Solutions at Numerical, which is a pretty novel job title, but essentially I work on systems of trust and caller authentication in the calling and messaging world as well.
Fantastic. And joining from Numerical as well, we've got Brett. Brett, how are you doing? You okay?
Doing good. Thank you.
Thanks. What do you do at Numerical and how long have you been with the company?
So I'm the VP of engineering here. I've been with the company for about 6 months now, and exploring new ways that we can bring identity into the voice channel. So very excited to talk about it.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you. And Pierce, you've been in the industry rather a long time as well. I know in general, bringing your expertise to play at Numerical. What's your role with Numerical?
Well, I'm trying to help Brett and the others to understand what we did from a carrier perspective in terms of developing and implementing the stir, shake, and call authentication protocols, and then exploring ways that we can enhance and expand upon what was done there, and bring innovative solutions to people who are trying to get voice communications reliably to their customers, and eventually maybe enhanced on top of that.
Fantastic. And joining us as well, we have Alec. Alec, introduce yourself and your company and your relationship with Numerical.
Hello, my name is Alec. I work at TransNexus. I've been at TransNexus since 2015, I believe. We're a shaken vendor and certificate authority. We've worked a lot with folks at Numerical, and especially Pierce, in Addis, working on standards, and I think we have a lot of similar views on the importance of attestation.
Fantastic. So a shaken vendor, again, for the uninitiated watching this, you're thinking cocktails. Unfortunately not, but we're going to get to this. This is all about stir shaking. Now, stir shaking is something very much reserved for the US at the moment, but there's talk of it perhaps breaking out from US shores and going elsewhere. It's linked to the world of voice. It's linked to the scourge of robocalling. But Sarah and Alec, I know you've got a presentation you'll be sharing now, just to introduce the topic and what StirShaken is. And first of all, why StirShaken came around. What's the problem out there in the US market in the world of voice? And so was the solution needed? What is the solution? And then what's your take on it? And we'll go from there. Go for it. Feel free to share.
Sure. Let me share my screen here. My role here as the only non-engineer of our panel today, I have a legal background and operations background. And so I know we have a mixed audience of folks that may have different levels of familiarity with StirShaken and some of the concepts we're talking about today. So my goal here is to give, even if you are, not a telecom engineer, you're not deep in the voice world, deep into messaging, a basic understanding of what we're talking about here, because some of the concepts I think will resonate and be transferable without you needing to know a lot of telecom jargon. So I'm going to start real basic, and for those that are experts, it's probably going to be an oversimplification on some, but that's okay. So first, let's talk about phone numbers and what they're used for, because StirShaken is all about the phone numbers that are presented in calls. So phone numbers are great for routing calls to a specific destination. So, no more switchboard operators. We now have this string of phone numbers that very beautifully will get you to a specific caller, a specific calling party at a specific destination around the world. Works beautifully. But when it comes to the calling party number, not the person that you're trying to call, but the phone number that's being presented in caller ID, something that a lot of people may not know or may not think about is that phone number is entirely self-asserted, right? It is something that is placed into the call as a field where somebody's saying, this is my phone number on my outbound call, either by themselves or their service provider is going to place that into the call. There's not any inherent data in the phone call that can prove directly that the phone number that caller is showing in caller ID is actually a phone number in their control. There's no way today, based on how the system exists, for us to prove 100% that is indeed their phone number. So unless your service provider is restricting you to only displaying certain caller ID, like for example, on my cell phone, my service provider isn't going to let me put any phone number that I want into an outbound phone call. It's always going to show my mobile phone number. But for many business and other services, that's not the case. It's open and you can put different phone numbers into caller ID if your service provider doesn't restrict you from doing so. And it's not a perfect analogy, but how I like to think about this is similar to a sending address and a return address on a piece of mail, which may look different depending on where you are and which part of the world, but essentially that phone call, what's really important is the destination address when you're sending a letter, right? That's where you're trying to go. That's the thing that absolutely has to be right in order to get your piece of mail from where you are to where you need it to be, to whoever you want to send that letter to. The return address, you think about when you send a piece of mail, that's you saying, this is me, this is my address, but nobody checks that, right? You put that on there. It could be, you are currently sending a piece of mail from Italy, but you live in New York City. You could put your New York City address on there as the return mailing address and then send that piece of mail from Italy. It's not necessarily reflective of where you are and who you are in that exact moment. It's just meant to be used only in the event that the mail needs to be returned to you, right? So similarly, when you're putting a number in an outbound phone call, the reason why you would want to leave that open and let folks put whatever they want, potentially within limitations, into caller ID, or at least have some freedom, is so that callers that may be using multiple different phone providers can mix and match where they want to make that phone call from and who they want to use as their service provider when they're making that call. And the fact that that is possible and fundamentally how the voice system works means that calling services have gotten a lot more flexible. There's been a lot more competitors that have been able to make voice service offerings, and it's really reduced the cost of making a voice call to the point where most of us on our personal devices have unlimited calling plans. It's not really unlimited within reason, but effectively unlimited calling plans, right? So there's a lot of reasons why we want this to happen, why we want that freedom in this sort of self-asserted caller ID. And just keep in mind, originally there was no caller ID. So it didn't matter where you were making phone call from. It wasn't displayed at all. So that now you are asserting, this is what I want to show up as my caller ID, but there's no fundamental truth there. So insert a lot of problems and a lot of issues with folks spoofing phone numbers that they don't have, that are the FBI's phone number, that are the IRS and other government agencies' phone numbers. Freedom, of course, people are going to exploit it and creates a problem. So StirShaken was a system that was essentially designed to take that phone number that was in caller ID, that fundamentally we don't know when I receive a call. I don't know anything about whether or not that's the actual phone number of the person that's calling me. Anybody who's gotten a phone call from their own phone number knows that's often not the case, and you can't trust what that number is. So the idea with StirShaken was, let's tack on some sticky notes around that number where other people will come in and they will sign and they will attest to say, I think that number that's in caller ID is this person's actual phone number. We're going to add those additional bits and bytes of data on top and those signatures to all give the call recipient more confidence and more trust to say that this is the person's actual phone number. But the important thing to recognize here is, of course, these are also people that are making assertions. We still don't have anything fundamental that says this is somebody's actual phone number 100% for sure. We're just adding more signatures on top of the call and more self-assertions to say, yep, I think that's right. Yep, I think that's right. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Here's how that works in practice. So when somebody is making a phone call, let's say they've got 999, this would not be allowed for other reasons, but let's say for purposes of fake phone calls, that's the number that somebody wants to show in caller ID. Their service provider is going to look at that phone number and they're going to add their signature, assuming that they are signing calls, which we'll talk about later. But assuming that they're signing calls under StirShaken, they're going to tack on their sticky note, their signed affidavit, their signed attestation saying, here's what I know about that phone number that is in caller ID. And they're going to assign a level to that, a level of attestation, either an A, a B, or a C. But essentially, just for you to know, again, this is the service provider saying, here's what I think I know about whether that phone number that's in caller ID is the caller's actual phone number. But those
sorry, Sarah, sorry about interrupting you, but when you say A, B, or C, so that's really the scale used in the in the US, just those three, basically 1, 2, 3. That's it. So A is kosher or good, B and C in simple language.
For sure, yeah, and I'll actually jump right to that. So essentially,
there we go. Sorry.
No worries.
No,
I had these in the other order
I didn't
before.
know that. It was A, B, C. All right, very good. Yeah.
It's all good. Yeah, so essentially what these three letters mean is they're meant to ascribe what this service provider that's adding its signature, its sticky note, as I like to think of it, onto that phone number and saying, yep, oh, I know something about that. Here's what they're saying they know. So with C is essentially, in plain terms, I don't know anything about the caller or their phone number. I don't know anything at all. I'm just carrying this call. It came to me. I'm passing it on. I don't know anything about it. B means I know something about the caller, but I don't know for sure whether or not they're authorized to display this particular phone number, right? So if you think about the freedom that I talked about before, this might be a service provider that's just carrying the call, but the customer may have gotten their actual phone number from somewhere else. So they don't know anything about the relationship between this business and this phone number because some other vendor might have given it to them. they're just carrying this call. So they know the caller, or they're saying that they know something about the caller, right? Again, these are self-assertions. They're saying they know the caller, but they're not saying that they know anything about the phone number in particular that's showing in caller ID. And then A, the highest level of the framework that exists today, is essentially the service provider saying, I both know something about the caller that's making this phone call, and I'm also claiming that I know that they are authorized to use this phone number. These are claims, but it's both of those, and that's that top thing, is I know the caller and I know the phone number. So these are attestations by the service provider. It may or may not, we'll talk about this as well, is a service provider that's signing the call, which may or may not be the service provider that's directly servicing the caller, right? Which is why, you know, you might have asked for C, well, how could they not know anything about the caller, right? Aren't they their service provider?
Yeah.
In this case, it might be a service provider that's further down the line and they may not have a direct relationship with the caller. So that's where that C level may come in. And as we'll talk about, oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to add on here because I think that your postal mail example is is a really good example. It's really easy to understand. If we take a look at these A, B's, and C's here with the postal example, an A, so first of all, the A, B, and C in this example would be actually assigned by the post office. That's kind of like the service provider, right? And in the A example, that would basically be the post office saying, the return address on this letter is actually what I know that particular customer's return address is. So not only did I pick it up from them and I know that it's them, but the address that they're saying is the return address is actually their address. And I know that for a fact. An example of a B would be like, let's say, for example, you're working from home and you're sending an office letter from your house address, right? So you're using a return address that that is still you, but the post office has no idea why you're using it. They're not involved in that business. So they're basically saying, I know I picked it up from this person who's on my route, and you know I'm associated to them, so I know who they are, but the address they're using, I don't know why they're using it. And then a C, the example that I would use here is sometimes post offices have to deliver mail to other post offices. And the example there would be is, for a C would be, I don't know where this came from. I don't know who the customer is. I can't really attach to the addresses. And so that's the C that's put on it.
So we've got a question there, Brett. So what's the difference between C-level attestation and a call with no attestation? It seems they both signal that nothing is known about the caller. Fair assessment?
I think that that's a fair assessment, and I think it's a great question too. The difference between a C and not having an attestation is, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit later in the discussion, but all of this comes down to transmitting this information all the way through the network and the terminating service provider making judgments based on that information that comes through. Having a C basically means somebody said something about it. Okay, but yes. Not only that, one of the other things that we haven't talked about yet is when an A, B, and C is put on these calls, the post office here, the service provider, actually puts a fingerprint on that attestation as well. So you can see which post office had to say this. One of the big differences at not having a C even is that you have no idea what post office it came from. You couldn't even go back and ask somebody about it or tell them, hey, stop sending me mail. You wouldn't know where it came from. So a big part of having an A, B, and C is not just knowing what the post office knew, but it's also knowing what post office it came from.
So clearly a lot of thought has been put into the structure of ABC. I know when he moved to the SMS world, there are various MEF members who in their authentication, verification, proving structure, they have, well, I know one which has 1 to 5 rating. I know another who verifies companies. It's a percentage ranging from 0 to 100. But it was, a lot of time was spent just making it as simple as possible for people to understand with the ABC. So you don't have any shades of gray in there with A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So simplicity was the driver in just having those three. Is that correct?
I think it was. I mean, I wanted to add in terms of messaging, for those familiar with the messaging world, you
Yeah.
don't have this freedom where you can just, anybody can put whatever number on there, right? There's the link in between, only one service provider can send text messages from one number at a time. You can't buy, a text enabled number from one service provider and then send messages from that number over a different service provider. It doesn't work that way, right? So that's why you don't need this system in messaging, but because of just the fundamental way that voice works and that we've broken that link between a phone number and a single service provider, that's why you have to create this entire system to try and
Well,
put
you
them
can
back
definitely
together.
spoof things in messaging, Sarah, for sure.
Well,
but
that's true. Yeah,
there isn't that specific. I can put whatever I want in ultimately, but there isn't that
sure.
specific link like in voice. Yeah.
So I'm going to volunteer something, but before I do, I want to ask Sarah, do you have more slides that you need to present?
I do not. That's it for me.
Okay, and I know that we have some more that will be helpful for people to see. That's from Alec, and I think you're going to present that next, but I'm going to give you, so if you want to bring that up, I'll just tag on to the question that was asked, and I liked it a lot because when we were doing the standards development for Shaken, and we were considering, what would we put into the information that we were sending from the guy that's, or the carrier that's signing the call to the carrier that's going to terminate the call and present information to their subscriber. What should we put in there? And we were kind of concerned that if we only signed the call and we didn't put any other additional information in there, we might be communicating that there is more trust available in that call than there really is. And so we thought it was important to differentiate what we knew about the call to help the terminating service provider and their subscriber to understand how much information we could provide that would help them to know how much they should trust the call. And now I worked at Sprint at that time, and we had a bunch of older mobile telephony switches, older technology that wasn't voice over IP. And to be able to communicate those values down to the device, it was going to be difficult because the standards that we were using at that time were very old. The switches were old. Trying to get any kinds of changes were going to be difficult. And so I kind of obsessed about this and thought, well, if we can get it down to just 2 bits, and I mean 2 binary digits, maybe we have a hope of being able to communicate something down to the device so that it would display it. So I'm just giving that as background. That's a little bit of, weeds. Good. So, a little history. And so I wrote to the IP&I group, and I said, for us to be able to use this, for carriers to be able to use this, we need to make this attestation dead simple. We need to make it as simple as we possibly can. And I proposed 4 values. And the 4 values were essentially what Sarah and Brett have described, but there was a 4th value, and that value was no attestation. And the slight differentiation there, the thing that I thought was helpful in doing that was, if you look at the names that are in the standard for those particular levels of attestation, they actually have names. A is called a full attestation. You know both the caller and their authority to use the number, at least you think you do. B is the caller and you don't really know about their authority to use the number. We've already said that. And then C is called, and it's called, the B is called a partial attestation. So there's full, partial, and then the C attestation is called a gateway attestation. And that was very specifically talking about gateway service providers. And for those who don't know what that term means, is when you send a call internationally into the United States from outside of the United States, that service provider that accepts that call coming inbound internationally is called a gateway provider. So that gateway attestation was very specifically supposed to mean for international calls that were originated and then sent into the United States. So that gateway provider can't possibly know anything about the caller, They don't know anything about their authority to use the telephone number. They don't even know if the guy that handed them that call was the originator of the call. They know nothing about it, but they are the gateway provider. They can put their signature on there, and then if there's a trace back where somebody's trying to look for where did this call come from, they're holding up their hand and saying, I'm the international gateway provider that signed this call. If you need to do a trace back, you can start with me, and then I'll tell you which trunk I got, which international service provider handed it to me. And then I thought it was important that there are intermediate service providers within the United States who might have gotten a call in from a gateway provider. They might have gotten it from an originating provider that didn't sign the call. So they don't know anything about where the call came from or whether the number is supposed to be there. And so that was going to be the no attestation. I'm not a gateway provider. I'm not the originating service provider. I just going to sign this call. And if you want to start a trace back, I'm it. Talk to me. I'll tell you where I got it from. And that was not adopted by the standards group, but that's the history on it.
Well, thank you so much. Keeping it really, really simple. That explains it very well. So I think we need to come back tomorrow, all of us listening and myself included, and I'm going to have a test tomorrow to see what I learned during class today.
There will be a quiz.
Full partial gateway. There we go. ABC. James, you can do it. You can remember that. Nice. Thank you very much, Pierce. Really, really good detail and simply put. So anyone watching this, particularly on the recorded session after the fact, that's going to be super valuable. Lovely. So carry on. Off we go. Sarah,
did you want to speak to any of the rest of this, or did you want to discuss another topic?
Oh, is it Pierce you're talking about? You're talking to
Alec.
Oh, sorry, Alec.
Yeah,
it's Alec's presentation. Yeah.
I guess I think that kind of we've talked a little bit about what Shaken does, and I think I want to expand on that a little bit more because we often hear a point of confusion. Everyone looks at Shaken and says, "Oh, this is all about preventing robocalls or illegal calls, or it's about preventing spoofed calls." But if you actually kind of look at the standards, it really isn't about that. But it is intended to be used for that. And so I guess I want to walk through where that use comes out of, right? What this information, this attestation and knowing who's originating the call, how that actually helps you to prevent robocalls. And then I think towards the end, we'll talk about whether Shaken is working or not. And I'll kind of show a little bit about maybe why it's not working as well as it could. So, as we've talked about, Shaken provides that attestation. But one of the core things which we hinted on a little is that it provides a way for the terminating service provider to immediately, before they've even answered the call, accepted that call, know who is originating that call, to what service provider is originating that call, at least. And that can be a very powerful feature when you combine that along with the attestation when you're trying to do your analytics to determine if this call is perhaps an illegal robocall or it is not an illegal robocall. And that call validation treatment, CVT is what we call that, which is what's defined in the Shaken standards as doing that analytics, although that's really a black box from the Shaken standards perspective. It doesn't actually explain how you do that analytics. So Shaken really becomes this input into this analytics function. And so let's kind of walk through an example call flow of the problem with trying to do analytics before you have Shaken. So here's a simple example. Most call flows involve more providers than this, but I'll explain. So we start with, on the left, we've got a bad subscriber and a good subscriber. So these are two different people. One of them has bad intentions and one of them has good. And they use two different originating service providers. So they've each contacted a different service provider to originate their calls. In our experience, you tend to see service providers that more target that volume of calls and allow their customers to maybe make illegal calls. And you have other service providers who are a little bit more aware of what their customers are doing and make sure their customers aren't making illegal calls. So you tend to have different service providers for good actors and bad actors. Both of those subscribers in this example are going to place a call, and the good subscriber is going to use their calling number. But the bad subscriber is also going to use the good subscriber's calling number. So he's going to spoof the good subscriber's number. And so those originating service providers are going to send the call to some transit provider. And that transit provider is then going to send it probably to another transit provider and another. There's going to be multiple hops, but eventually it's going to reach the terminating service provider. If you think about what that terminating service provider is going to get, for both of those calls, they're going to get the exact same thing. They're going to get a SIP invite with the calling number of the good subscriber and the call number of their subscriber that's terminating that call. They can't tell the difference between those calls. So when a bad actor spoofs a good subscriber's calling number, it can be very difficult and arguably in some cases, if the bad actor does a good enough job, impossible for the terminating service provider or their customer to identify and distinguish between those two calls. And this is where Shaken provides some change. So with Shaken, the originating service providers, both the good actor and the bad actor, if you could go to the next slide, please. Those two originating providers are going to sign that call. And what that really just means is insert this signed object into the call signaling. But when they do that, as Brett mentioned, they're going to put their fingerprint on it. So you're not only going to know the attestation that originating service provider is assigning to that call, but you're going to know who the originating service provider is. So then when the call reaches the transit provider and then gets sent to the terminating service provider, even if the bad subscriber and the good subscriber use the exact same number, the signaling that the terminating service provider is going to receive is no longer the same. You can see in one case, they're going to get a call signed with the bad originating service provider certificate. In the other case, they're going to get one signed with the good originating service provider certificate. So there's now a difference between those two calls, which allows them to use that CVT, that analytics function, to analyze traffic over an extended period of time and make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. If you see half the calls you get from that bad originating service provider are bad calls, when you get another call from them, you're probably going to assume maybe it's going to be bad. And if none of the calls you get from the good originating service provider have ever historically been bad, if you get another call from them, you're probably going to assume, there's a good chance that this is also a good call. That's really the power that Shaken provides.
Sorry, Alec, we never like assuming anything here at MEF. So again, from my personal knowledge as well, STIAS, STIVS, and CVT. What do you mean by those? Or have I just missed something?
STI is secure telephone identity, and AS is the authentication service, and VS is the verification service. And what that's
no, great. Carry on, please. Yeah.
I think Alec
froze up. There you go. Keep
Brett
going, Alec.
Pierce. Oh, yeah.
So the authentication service creates the passport, and the verification service verifies the passport.
Okay, and the CVT
is the call validation treatment. That's that analytics function that we were talking about.
Okay. Call validation treatment is to what do you want to display to the subscriber? It's that black box that given the information you have, what would you want to display to the
Well, that leads into a question we've received as well. Does branded calling, whatever that means, is branded calling something specific? Is it something specific to the US in general? Does branded calling follow the STIR/SHAKEN protocol? Is branded calling simply come up where you have literally the brand of the caller come up as the is that instead of a number?
So branded calling means a lot of things to a lot of people. Sometimes it only means calling names. Sometimes it might mean additional information such as a company logo, maybe the reason for calling, that sort of thing. And there's a not quite yet standard called rich call data. That is a STIR standard, and there's work going on to use that to be able to present, to authenticate, to sign, to put that post-it note that includes that additional level of information. That's what I meant at the introduction when I mentioned enhanced calling functionality. So there's work going on in the standards to support using STIR/SHAKEN or the STIR/SHAKEN technology for authenticating branded calling. But there isn't a standard for branded calling. So any of the work that leverages like the RCD standard that's being developed is all going to be commercial development. So the answer is it can if the people who design the branded calling solutions choose to use the standard. They don't have to. It's just whether they do or they don't.
And this is the
And
key thing. There are multiple branded calling solutions. It's because it's a commercial thing. So yeah.
right.
Okay.
And the majority of the solutions that are on the market today do not use the stir shaken protocols. It's done separately, sort of outside of the call path.
Correct.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Very good question. Thank you, viewer.
Back to you, Alec.
Well, that's really all I have from this point. I think one of the questions that we were going to talk about was, how effective has stir shaken been, and then maybe we can get to some more the next slide once we talk
Alec,
through
you
that a
mentioned
little.
when you were teeing it up, you were saying this came around, but it wasn't specifically aimed. It was developed, but it wasn't specifically aimed at robocalling. Was it just aimed generally to secure the voice market and re-establish trust or retain trust? And then the scourge of robocalling was brought up by the FCC, and this was beefed up or retasked and pointed at robocalling, and then everyone jumped on it thinking, hey, this is the silver bullet for robocalling. So what was the path here?
So Alec, can I
Sure.
give it a shot? Okay. So the original standard written that's based on that we now call STIR, and it's called STIR because it stands for Secure Telephone Identity Revisited. And the reason it's called Revisited is because the original standard that was written to support the use of this idea of identity, authenticated identity, cryptographically signed identity in call signaling was done in, I think it was RFC 4916, quite a long time ago. And then it never really got adopted, never really got used. And when after the FCC, or slightly before the FCC's 2016 robocall strike force, there was a lot of encouragement from folks in the FCC for the industry to devise a solution to combat illegal robocalling and specifically number spoofing. And so the work that was done after that as part of the revisited part of identity and then the secure handling of authenticated asserted information, I can't remember, using tokens, the shaken standard was all built on top of that. So originally it was just a way for a entity that was originating a communication session. Doesn't even have to be voice, it could be messaging, it could be whatever. It's just using a SIP protocol to include a cryptographic signature that I'm the originating entity. Then later on, we adopted that and adapted that to try and combat number spoofing and illegal robocalling. That was the genesis behind that next layer of work. Go ahead, Alec.
Yeah, so I guess where this distinction comes is that stir shaken's goal is to prevent illegal spoofing and illegal robocalls. But the way it does that really has nothing to do with taking some specific action. I hear a lot of people think, oh, A means it's a legal call, and B means it's maybe not a legal call, and C means it's an illegal call. Not at all. Where Shaken comes in is by providing this mechanism for the terminating service provider to receive the call from a transit provider who maybe received it from another transit, another transit, but the terminating service provider can tell the service provider that's originating the call, we are now making it very difficult for bad actors that are service providers to allow these illegal robocalls into the network, because they have to stamp their name on it and say, I'm the responsible for the origination of this call. And then everyone downstream can see that you've said that. And so if they see a lot of illegal robocalls, well, you're going to get in trouble. Versus having to go back hop by hop for every single phone call that you need to do this traceback for, which can be a very labor-intensive process. It can now be done in real time before you've even accepted the call. That's where Shaken is so powerful. So if there's any kind of highlight about this A, B, and C are used for, this CVT function, but they're not indicative of what is a good or a bad call. It's really more of who's originating it.
That's super important, because I've heard it said before, and so many people get it wrong, and they just reinforce that. Can I just ask, Transnexus? You mentioned something else very important. There's a service provider, because in the US, I know there are literally hundreds of service providers. So I myself come from
thousands.
Yeah, I come from the SMS world, and I remember I had a job with Cineverse many years ago, managing the P2P SMS reach globally. And I just know how many operators, service providers they were in the US. And there were literally hundreds within the US. And we're not familiar with that over in my neck of the woods, over in Europe. And hey, you go to Ethiopia, there's one, Ethio Telecom, that's it. So it's a very, very different ballpark. And when you move into the voice world, that proliferates even further. As you mentioned, there are thousands of service providers. So, Alec, at Transnexus, who are your customers and what exactly do you do for them?
We are a software provider. So we provide software for a lot of things like least cost routing and toll fraud prevention. But one of those things that's kind of relevant to the conversation today is we provide that STI-AS software, the authentication software, and the VS software, the verification software. So our customers are service providers that need software to sign their calls, to verify calls, to route their calls, things like that. That's what we do in the telecom ecosystem. Now,
in the US, the regulation, what are the regulations? Because clearly there are thousands of service providers. There are going to be some bad ones. There are going to be some good ones out there. Is there anything out there saying you all have to essentially have some form of authentication? Is that a law out there, or it's a legal standing?
Yeah. Yes. There is currently one exemption right now. Service providers that use non-SIP signaling, so TDM, anything that can't carry that identity header, are not required.
The really old stuff, time division multiplexing. I remember that from so many decades ago myself. Yeah.
So any non-SIP, but every other service provider within the US is required to have implemented shaken.
Which may be a good segue to talk about your next slide, Alec, for how it actually works.
Yeah, so, well, just quickly, James, there's a law called the Trace Act, and that was written by Congress, so it's a federal law that requires service providers to sign the calls, and then there's also FCC mandate to sign.
So did that act that came after? So the FCC started looking in 2016. That came as a result of that, or was it before?
The Trace Act, I think, was signed into law in December of 2020, I think.
Okay, so it was absolutely as a result of the FCC investigating and kicking off the process. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's separate organizations. The FCC is a regulatory organization, and Congress is, well, it's Congress, so it's legislative.
The Trace Act basically gave the FCC a lot more authority, and actually mandates the FCC use that authority.
But does it actually give the FCC recourse and teeth to go to someone and say, hey, you are a bad service provider, we're going to fine you, we're going to stop your service, something like that?
So they have the authority for fining. There's no penalties written into the Trace Act. The FCC has the authority to fine, but as far as like jail time, it's not in the Trace Act, and I don't think the FCC has the authority to do that. But I don't really know.
Have people been in the US? Have people been? It's a very British English phrase: banged up, locked up in jail because of there being exceedingly bad providers.
Not that I know of.
Anything really bad? No, it's never.
No, instead they get like $300 million fines that they can't pay.
Oh, okay. So
it's largely fine based, but there are other charges that have been brought against folks. But that's usually in the case of crimes that are otherwise crimes, right? If they are defrauding people and taking their money by pretending to be the IRS, they would be pursued based on those criminal violations, right? So there are people that are pursued, but there's not that's typically takes precedent, right? If you're committing fraud over these, which are generally, as Pierre said, more fine-based based on the law.
And I'll risk a partial question to Randy Warshaw, or a partial answer to Randy Warshaw's question, because he asked,
let me have a look at that. Sorry, I missed that. You go for it.
Yeah, he said, why hasn't stir shaken been effective? And I think part of it is what we're describing. Alex said it, and so did Sarah, that the way that we're trying to use stir shaken to stop or inhibit illegal robocalling is an enforcement mechanism. And so what we're using stir shaken for is there's two things. One is it gives the terminating service provider some more information that they can use as part of the call validation treatment to warn the subscriber and or block the calls. I won't go into that any further. And then the other way is that that thumbprint that Alec was talking about, that the originating service provider added to the call, that's forensic evidence. So it can be used by the state attorney generals, by the FCC Enforcement Bureau. But that, once you have to try and once you have to try and take the bad service provider to court, that's a problem, because, the court systems are slow. It takes an awful lot of labor, it takes an awful lot of work to be able to get to the point where you can actually take them to court and try and find them. So that's, to me, the main reason why stir shaken hasn't been as effective as we'd like, is because right now we rely on guesses at the terminating side to use the information, which isn't guaranteed that will happen very well, because a lot of times the call validation treatment, the analytics, are a separate vendor, a separate provider, as compared to the person that's doing the verification service, and the integration between those might be very tight. It's imperfect. And then if you have to rely on the courts to do the, whack-a-mole job on the bad service providers, it's very time consuming, slow, expensive, etc. So there's still this is a very active area of standards and commercial development.
Can I ask, or all of you, can I ask then, again, this is a novice, it's my lack of knowledge here asking, but is there some form of database, shared database available from somebody which then has the bad service providers listed? So for example, here in the UK, insurance companies share knowledge on individuals and organizations who they suspect or have been proven of committing insurance fraud, so that I don't just move from one insurance company to another. Is there a shared database or anything that is out there is very much unofficial?
Yeah, Sarah, does that exist?
It does not. If anybody would like to help me in advocating for such a thing, that's a current project of mine, but there is a thing called the Robocall Mitigation Database, which is a voluntary system of registration for U.S. service providers, which means there's a lot of people that have not volunteered to sign up for it.
Do you know, Sarah, what I'm thinking? Because we've got we've had a business SMS code of conduct for many years. We could have a
we certainly could.
Voice code of conduct, something along those lines, with members signing up, self-regulation, but then everyone watching each other. So the companies that have signed up to it, everyone is aware of them, and if they could be deemed as being bad or good. So self-regulation within meth. That's an idea.
I think that there's some bigger challenges in the ecosystem for us to get to a point like that, because keep in mind the fingerprints that are on the calls are that of the service providers and not of the call originators themselves. So generally the bad actors for making the phone calls. And the way that stir shaken is set up today is that the fingerprint isn't coming from the call originator, it's coming from the service provider. So the ecosystem is assuming that we trust the service providers, that the service providers are going to do a good job of doing KYC, of knowing who's making those calls and of vetting that information out. They put their fingerprint on that. They basically say, with A, B, or C, they're saying, I know who this customer is. But very frequently, the service providers are part of the bad actor behavior. we don't know necessarily that they're doing things the way that they're supposed to do. So keep in mind that when the service providers put their fingerprint on and attest A, B, or C, it's done per local policy. While there are guidelines on how A, B, and C is supposed to be done, at the end of the day, they can do whatever they want. They shouldn't do whatever they want, but they will end up doing whatever they want. That's on the originating side. On the terminating side, on the SCIVS side, the terminating service providers will use that information however they want. Maybe they'll use it, maybe they won't use it. So right now, there's a lot of local policy that happens in the network that's a little bit outside of control, both putting information in and interpreting that information. And but at the end of the day, per what we were saying a second ago, there's no way on the terminating service provider to know who is making this call, that it's a specific company that's defrauding people that we need to block. All we know is the service provider that's involved in it. Now, that's a huge change from before Stir Shaken, because, and this is part of the reason why Stir Shaken has been partially effective, is because before Stir Shaken, those calls would come in and they'd come in mass, and we wouldn't know where to start with enforcement, with blocking, with pulling the plug, or knowing what to do to stop that traffic. We would have to do hop by hop, tracing the call, and hopefully you'll have intermediate providers that are going to help you out. But Stir Shaken, you have the fingerprint of who let the traffic on the network, and that way it shortcuts all of that effort to find out where we need to go to.
Okay, so we've had one of our viewers stick his hand up. Stefan Engelbert, are you still there? Have you just gone? Stefan, he stuck his hand up, and I've never done this before in a live webinar. I'm going to try this. It may fail dramatically, but I'm going to allow him to talk. So, Stefan, you had your hand up. You had a question. Is there anything you would like to ask? I'm trying this. It failed. He's no longer there. But anyway.
No, I'm here, but I haven't even seen I put the hand
Hi,
up. It must have been an accident, to be honest.
Oh, it was an accident. Oh, okay.
No worries. Thank you.
No problem. All right. Thank you. So there we go. But that did work. Anyway, we have.
Yeah, at least we know it works.
We know it works. There we go. I tried something brand new in my nearly 3 years at MEF. I've never done that before, and I tried. But thank you, danke, Stefan. So anyway,
at least it was the first one.
Exactly. So we have some more questions here. So isn't another reason that Stir Shaken is not achieving the objective simply because, in simple language, hey, only approximately 30% of calls are actually attested because the rest aren't IP to IP? Is that a very practical reason as well as to why it might not be achieving its objectives?
So we see a pretty good volume of calls from a diverse set of service providers. So we can kind of try and estimate why we think Stir Shaken hasn't been effective. And I think there are really two reasons when we look at what we're seeing. The first reason, which we touched on a little bit, but I want to make sure we walk through, is kind of what this slide is showing. I think a lot of people have thought that what needs to happen is every call needs to be signed, and then you've implemented Stir Shaken. So you have these originating service providers who they're not signing the call, they're letting their downstream provider, a transit provider, sign the call, and they're thinking, oh, well, that solves the problem, right? Because the call's been signed, Stir Shaken has been completed. But who completes Stir Shaken is very vital to its success, because if you look at this example and think back to what we had before with a proper Stir Shaken implementation, the two calls going to the terminating service provider are now back to looking identical. There's no difference between them anymore if the transit provider is signing the call. The whole point, what made them different, was when the originating service provider was signed them and there it was a different provider. But if you just allow anyone in the call path to implement Shaken and say it's been done, you defeat the purpose of Shaken. So this is a major reason that Shaken has not been effective, because that CVT function gets two calls signed by the transit provider and they're back to indistinguishable and can't do anything different with them.
So in simple language, companies like yourselves aren't being vetted closely enough. So I could set myself up and go, hey, I'm going to pass something and do something else. I'm a Shaken provider. but I could be actually not checking anything, not really verifying anything, not doing my job, and just passing everything and collecting some cash, and that's it. So there's some bad companies out there.
Well, and now Alec, keep me straight on this, and Sarah and Brett, but my memory is that the FCC has also made it a rule, and I know that I advocated for it, which was if you receive an unsigned call and you're capable of signing it, you have to sign it. So that would mean that the transit provider signing on behalf of the bad originating service provider might just be because they received an unsigned call. And so it goes back to being that kind of gateway example of where I don't know anything about the caller, I don't know anything about their authority to use the number, but I am signing this call as per my requirement. And if you need to do traceback, you can start with me.
That's exactly
That
right,
would be the
right?
case.
So if it is unsigned, it's not that the transit provider is doing something wrong by signing the call. They're actually required, if it isn't signed, to sign that call. So the problem is the fact that the person ahead of them in line isn't signing the call. And when I referred to this robocall mitigation database before, that was really meant to be a pool for the FCC to look and see, each provider, when they submit their information to that database, they're also supposed to submit a certification saying whether they've implemented stir shaken and are signing calls. The problem is with really two problems. One is that a lot of service providers have asserted that they have fully implemented stir shaken, but are not actually signing their own phone calls. And then two, there's a lot of people who are acting as service providers that aren't in the database at all. So it's really hard to get our arms around it and begin to enforce against some of these folks that aren't signing phone calls if we either don't know who they are, or we're not sure whether or not they're signing phone calls or haven't pursued enforcement. So it's created this environment where service providers are all pointing fingers at each other, including these transit providers, and saying, well, why is your signature? Why aren't your customers signing? We're like, well, go after the customer then, versus, is it the service provider? Is it the regulator that's supposed to be enforcing? How do we proceed from here is really the debate going on right now.
Sarah, I wanted to add on to that too, because a lot of people who are in the robocall mitigation database will say things like they are fully implementing stir shaken, not because they do it, but because their downstream provider does it for them. So it turns into a lot of misinformation. But you can kind of see from this diagram, two parts of this really. If you're a bad actor, you can simply just not sign anything, and then you don't have your fingerprint on the call. Then it's harder for people to point the finger at you. But on the other side of this, if that transit provider that you see in the middle of the diagram right there is handling traffic from both the good and the bad service provider, and they are not signing the calls, but the transit provider is signing the call, when that bad call makes it to the terminating service provider and they reach out to perform enforcement, where does enforcement go? It goes to that transit provider. That transit provider gets the finger pointed straight at them, right?
Yeah.
So part of the issue in the transit provider doing this, when they don't have a direct authenticated relationship with the originator, is that they put the crosshairs directly on them rather than requiring their upstream customers to sign calls themselves and have the crosshairs on them instead.
Lovely. Thank you, Brett. We're nearly, believe it or not, our time is coming to an end in 3.5 minutes. Alec, there's a question aimed firmly at you from Randy Warshaw, if you have a look. Is out of band shaken, for example, using TransNexus call placement service, getting any traction? This would overcome the non-IP legs losing the passport token. What do you say?
Yeah, we continue to provide out-of-band shaken as a solution to our customers using our authentication verification service, and really it's publicly accessible. Any service provider in the United States can access it. We don't do any logging in that system, so we really have no visibility into the volume over time. I think right now where we're in a position is just waiting for the FCC. It's been a while, 6 months or if not more than that. The FCC kind of basically looked at where are things with the non-IP standards, both out-of-band shaken and extending stir shaken over TDM, and took some feedback from the ecosystem as a whole, really from the public, about whether or not they should change the mandates and require service providers to do something for the non-IP issue. And they have not yet made a ruling on that. So once they make a ruling, I suspect, depending on what that ruling is, we may see a significant improvement, or we may not. Again, just going to depend on that ruling.
Wow, this robocalling thing really set off a chain of events, because I know the FCC is really all over A2P SMS now as well. I'm seeing they're into IoT and some sort of trust mark for IoT, potentially the back end of next year as well. So it's all happening over in the US with the FCC. We are now 2 minutes away from the close. So closing remarks. Sarah, as the VP of Trust Solutions, and this is all about trust, I will leave the initial closing remark to you. Go for it.
Sure. I just want to say thanks for having us. And for those that are part of our global audience here, exactly what James was saying. Stir shaken there's a lot of international stir shaken related proposals. So we really welcome your eyes and your thoughts on what's happening with the FCC, because as we've indicated, a lot's going on right now and a lot's yet to be worked out. So welcome international eyes, international participation, and please reach out to us if you have any questions or if you want to get more involved.
Fantastic. And we were seeing more of numerical across MEF. Numerical are fairly new into MEF, but we're seeing across working groups and at events going forward, I'm sure. Piers, it's a real pleasure having had you here. You've been instrumental in putting this standard together. And so having your expertise and being able to speak simple language for the benefit of people like me has been very, very important. I've learned personally a lot. As I said, send me that exam for tomorrow at this time. Let's see what I've remembered. We'll go that. Alec, your practical side of things as well, being that shaken provider, learnt a lot from you. And Brett, your expertise as well has been super helpful. So that's it, folks. The topic attestation may sound very, very fierce, but at the end of the day, it's about proving, it's about trust, and it's about re-establishing trust, because this one really is about re-establishing trust. It's not about maintaining trust. It's re-establishing trust in the world of voice. Voice has been around for almost 150 years. It's going to be around for a good long time to come. It's something inherent in us human beings, talking, the power of the spoken word. And we just need to really re-establish that trust and continue building. So thank you to Numerical for sponsoring. Thank you, audience. And there's going to be a blog post associated with this webinar coming out. And you will see this uploaded in due course, along with this presentation as well. And please join us very soon for another MEF Live webinar. I'm James Williams, Director of Programs, and thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the show. Goodbye. Bye.